Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Camfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com.
Hi, I'm Jonathan, the producer of Victor's Children here, handling intro duties this time around. This episode deals with the recent Air Canada flight attendant strike, and while technically this will be our episode for September, we decided to release it early while the events of the strike are still fresh. The historic law-defying strike by Air Canada flight attendants, lasting from August 16th to the 19th, caught the attention of many people here in the Canadian state and beyond. In the first part of this episode, David interviews Adam King about the strike and the questions it raises. This is followed in the second part by a public talk planned before the flight attendant strike, which David gave in Winnipeg on August 26, presented by the 1919 Workers Collective, about the history of state restrictions on workers' freedom to strike, their impact, workers' defiance of these restrictions, and what conclusions people who want a powerful working-class movement should draw from this history. The talk was entitled Against the Law, How Labor Law Restricts Strikes and What Workers Can Do About It. Now, without further ado, on to David's conversation with Adam King.
Before we start this episode of Victor's Children, I'll just mention that if you'd like to buy a copy of my book, Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left, you can order it from the website of Fernwood Publishing at a 15% discount using the code RF, that's Red Flags RF, up to October the 19th, 2025. Feel free to check that out. Now, some 10,500 flight attendants at Air Canada and Air Canada Rouge, who are members of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, waged a dramatic and inspiring strike from August the 16th until early on August the 19th. Strikers boldly defied the federal government's attempt to end their strike. This strike caught the attention of many people and was widely sympathized with, in spite of the inconvenience that it was causing travelers. By the way, I should just explain that Air Canada is a private corporation, but flight attendants are members of the Canadian Union of Public Employees because those workers originally unionized back when Air Canada was a crown corporation. So this was a really important strike, and I'm really glad to be joined by Adam King to discuss it. Adam, could you introduce yourself to listeners?
Yeah, I'm an assistant professor in the Labor Studies program at the University of Manitoba, and most recently co-author of the book Work and Labor in Canada, Critical Issues with Mark Thomas and Andrew Jackson. And I also write a weekly newsletter for The Maple that covers labor and the labor movement. And in the most recent issue of this, I discuss the strike at Air Canada.
Yeah, so that's something which I definitely encourage listeners to check out. And I should just mention, of course, that Adam and I are co-workers in the Labor Studies program at the University of Manitoba. Okay, Adam, to start us off, can you give us a little bit of background about what workers have been through at Air Canada in the past decade and a half or so, particularly flight attendants?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I would start by saying that there's been quite a bit of labor unrest in the airline industry broadly, just recently within the past few years, which I wrote about a couple of weeks ago, actually, in my column at The Maple. But this goes back, I think, decades, really. The airlines have been a central point of class struggle in Canada for a number of reasons. And in the early 2000s, if we just start from there, unions took considerable concessions during this period when Air Canada was under bankruptcy protection from 2003 to 2004. So unions, not just flight attendants, took deep concessions in their contracts around wages, pension entitlements, and other provisions. And then again, in the 2010s, the company was facing financial insecurity following the financial crisis in 2008-9. And in that case, over 2,000 employees were laid off across the occupations. That included flight attendants. And so the company faced a significant $2.85 billion pension shortfall during that period and sought relief from unions and the federal government, which they got. They essentially got a pension holiday for a period during that time. And during this period, the Harper conservative government refused relief on the pension issue and essentially pushed it all onto the workers. The government then provided a rescue package later on, along with other private investors, while the union was forced to take these deep concessions. So during this period, flight attendants twice voted down, excuse me, twice voted down tentative agreements in 2011, and they voted down that second contract still by 65%. And this was a contract that was unanimously recommended by their bargaining unit, which then led to the conservative government imposing arbitration. So this issue of government intervention into negotiations at Air Canada, especially with flight attendants, is not something new. This has gone on multiple times in the past. And actually, the Minister of Labor, Lisa Raitt, at the time toyed with the use of Section 107, which I know we'll discuss later, but it's the provision of the Canada Labour Code that was used during this strike and many others recently. She toyed with the idea of using this, and essentially she requested that at the time that the Federal Labour Board investigate if Air Canada was an essential service. And there was speculation that she knew very well that it wasn't, but this was just a delay tactic to essentially give her time to get back to work legislation in order. That's the old-fashioned way of crushing strikes, with actually tabling back to work legislation. So that episode produced an arbitrated collective agreement. It was the one that was in force before the 10-year one that just expired. So this would have been 2011 to 2015, and again, which contained considerable concessions. And so it wasn't just the flight attendants, too, that were experiencing this kind of heavy-handed government intervention and push toward deep concessions. The government also deployed back to work legislation against the pilots in 2012, which produced a wildcat strike and a sick out. And then as the company restructured financially, it extracted further concessions from workers in 2015 and essentially bought a decade of labor peace with a kind of really unorthodox and uncommon 10-year collective agreement that locked flight attendants into a really bad deal with only 2% wage increases annually for the life of that contract. And of course, this was during the period where the pandemic and the post-pandemic inflation took place. So there was a cost of living crisis. It was really borne by the workers while Air Canada essentially restructured. And during the pandemic, the company also received considerable financial help from the government. It received money through the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program and other financial assistance, all the while flight attendants, of course, were locked into this bad deal and really suffering through a cost of living crisis. So as we headed into the 2025 round, workers, of course, had been through a decade and a half or more of repeatedly taking concessions to prop up Air Canada, and were clearly fed up with the situation. And, in some senses, I think this could lead us to asking a deeper question about whether Air Canada is really a sort of failed experiment in privatization. This is a company that's kind of hobbled along from one round of bargaining to the next, facing various financial crises, and then eventually just imposing them or forcing the cost onto workers every few years. And, particularly, David, I know you write a lot about the climate crisis. I mean, I think we could ask some deeper questions about whether or not this is a company that should be taken back into public hands, not just in terms of better treatment of workers and financial management, but also to kind of manage the climate crisis, and ask some deeper questions about what the role of air travel should really be in a situation when we're facing a crisis like these multiple crises.
Yeah, I think you're right, of course, that there needs to be total rethink of transportation, right? And that couldn't be done possibly by private firms. It would only come through, I think, some kind of public ownership and restructuring of both air and ground transportation. But that would be taking us in a different direction. But I think it's a really important big question that we should keep in the background. So now we're in a situation where at Air Canada, something like 70% of the flight attendant workforce is women. Interestingly, I think about 3/4 of them have been with the company for less than 5 years. So there are lots of young workers. And my assumption is that lots of flight attendants just left Air Canada early on at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then there was a lot of hiring then after that. So can you take us through the situation in the months just leading up to the strike that's happened in terms of what's happened there, and how both union officials and rank and file flight attendants prepared for this fight and what their key demands were?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's a really important point that this is a female-dominated sector, and our colleague Julia Smith has done important research and writing on this, along with Joan Sangster. Really, the long struggle, to have this work recognized as important and fairly compensated, and fought back against a lot of really sexist provisions in terms of the hiring and treatment of flight attendants. There's actually a really interesting article in the Globe and Mail this week by a former flight attendant who's now a journalist, and I would encourage listeners to read that article, because it really does give you a good sense of just what it's actually like to be a flight attendant, some of the indignities faced, but also the training and skills that are necessary actually to do this job, and the way that the company discounts those in terms of how it actually compensates workers, I think is really interesting.
I'll put that into the show notes for this episode for listeners.
In terms of the pandemic, as I mentioned before, Air Canada, like many corporations, of course, received very large sums through the wage subsidy program and other supports. And actually, the Canadian government acquired roughly 7% of the shares in the company during the pandemic, which was actually rare in terms of getting ownership in a company in return for the public money that was dished out during the pandemic. Also, Air Canada and WestJet applied to the federal government for temporary exemptions from the mass termination provisions of the Canada Labour Code, which they received. So that allowed them to actually make layoffs that they would otherwise, under normal circumstances, not be allowed to do. Now, of course, the union contracts softened that somewhat, but even still, the fact that they had these exemptions was an important concession that they received during the pandemic. And I think one of the central demands in this round, this issue of unpaid work, is really interesting. So this is not something that just came up, of course. This is an industry practice that's been ongoing for a very long time. And it really does sort of transfer the costs of operating the airline onto workers in a very interesting and troubling way. I mean, every time that there's a delay, essentially, as passengers and flight attendants are sort of on the same page, as it's a headache for passengers, it's increasing the unpaid work time that flight attendants actually perform. And so CUPE's been engaged in this 2-year campaign, Unpaid Work Won't Fly. They held a national day of action in April 2023 at airports around the country. And they did this survey among members, which showed that on average, members were doing roughly 35 hours of unpaid work per month, and that this was a nearly universal experience among flight attendants. And then there's the issue, of course, of wages. I mean, heading into bargaining, new flight attendants were earning less than $2,000 per month and had received only a total of $3 per hour in raises over the life of that previous 10-year contract. So those two issues are really central and connected. The issue of unpaid work and then underpaid work for the actual time that you're compensated. So leading up to the strike, I mean, we were on track, I think, for a work stoppage months ago. And this was clear for those who were watching the negotiations. CUPE filed for conciliation in May, and as bargaining reached an impasse. So that was a pretty clear indication that the company was not making meaningful movement on most of the union's demands. The union then held practice pickets at major airports in the week before the official strike, which were also really encouraging, but did show that we were likely headed toward a strike. And despite so many workers being relatively new, I think the sense of anger and injustice was really palpable, and workers were really mobilized and ready to strike. They delivered one of the strongest strike mandate votes, I think, in recent Canadian history, with 99.7% voting to strike, with a nearly 95% turnout, which is really remarkable because this is a bargaining unit of over 10,000 members. And to have that level of turnout really shows a level of commitment and resolve, I think, that we'd like to see in every bargaining unit across the country, but it's really something, I think, to stand back and in awe of.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And also, I would just mention, I think it's an interesting piece of the puzzle to think about how all these young workers recently hired did not go through the experience of all the concessions. I mean, they lived with the results of that in their collective agreement and their conditions and so on, but they didn't have the kind of expectations lowering, I think, experience of being ground down by the employer and voting to reject tentative agreements, and yet nevertheless finding themselves forced into this arbitrated settlement and so on that you talked about earlier. So I think it's an interesting thing to think about there in terms of workers' expectations and past experiences.
Yeah, and it sort of makes me wonder if there aren't senior folks in the union and the bargaining units that are sort of bringing those young people along and educating them about the experience of those concessions. But it also may just be a matter of working under really bad conditions and just that experience alone being enough to motivate people to take collective action.
So when the strike started, how far apart were the two sides on the key issues that you've mentioned?
On both of those issues, the parties remained very far apart as the strike started. Air Canada was claiming publicly that they were offering a 38% wage increase, but this was a total compensation calculation. This is a common tactic that employers use to sort of mischaracterize their proposals at the table. CUPE was calling it a 17% increase over 4 years, so that was sort of where we were at prior to the strike in terms of compensation. And as QB characterized it, this came nowhere near catching up for the inflationary losses and concessions of the past contracts, which they were really trying to make up in this round of bargaining. So in terms of compensation, the parties were some distance apart. On unpaid work, QB maintained that all work should be paid. All ground work, that is, all work that's not when the plane is in the air, should be paid at the regular rate of compensation. And there was some movement in the airline industry around this issue already. So I think Air Canada understood that they were going to have to make concessions on this in the long term. The question was how much. Delta in the US is really the airline that sort of moved in this direction, which they started paying for ground work at 50% recently. But what's interesting there is that Delta is a non-union airline. And, I think you could understand this as part of their anti-union campaign or their union avoidance campaign, because they're currently the target of organizing campaigns from both the flight attendants union in the US and the transport workers union for bag handlers and other ground crew. So they're experiencing their own sort of labor woes at the moment and trying to, they're the last non-union holdout, really. They're major airlines in the US. And so I think you can understand that as part of their union avoidance campaign. But it does indicate that the industry is moving away from this practice. What they're trying to do is just contain the costs of it. So I think that was on sort of Air Canada's mind, that they were likely going to have to move on this issue. They were trying to limit how much they would actually have to move. And I think really just generally, as we were talking about before, there was just this question of just the dignity of their work, and really workers just really feeling like undervalued and like their work was not treated with dignity and respect. The idea that you would do nearly a week's worth of unpaid work in every month, I think, was just that was framed as a central campaign issue throughout, I think was really strategically important and really struck a chord with the public.
So then, what was the general expectation about how the federal government would intervene, either before a strike started or right after a strike began? And can you put that in the context of their pattern of intervening using the infamous Section 107 of the Canada Labour Code that you mentioned earlier, and just explain what that is for listeners?
Yeah, I think really the place to start is explaining Section 107. For those, I mean, I think like a year ago, most people had probably never heard of this before, and now the term Section 107 has become just part of the popular parlance. This is just an obscure section of the Canada Labour Code that really doesn't say a lot. It simply says that the minister can do certain things to promote industrial peace. And over the last year and a bit, the government has interpreted that to mean that they can take a wide range of actions to essentially end strikes that they find inconvenient. And as I mentioned before, the Harper Conservative Minister of Labor, they didn't think that this provision included these kinds of powers. I mean, they were playing around with it to see what they could do and send questions to the labor board in terms of, can you investigate this essential service, et cetera, to promote industrial peace, I guess. But they didn't interpret this to mean that you could end a strike by simply emailing the labor board and asking them to issue an order. So this is really what's happened over the past year, is that some policy wonk in the Liberal Party has decided that this is what this means, and they're testing it out. And so they've used it against a number of unions. The first instance under the Liberal Minister of Labor, Seamus O'Regan, was against the Teamsters, where he essentially directed an investigation, much like the Liberals had done, about whether or not there were essential services on the rails. And this delayed the Teamsters' ability to strike. The interesting thing about this is that the Canada Labour Code contains a provision around maintenance of activities, which means that employers and unions, when they enter bargaining, have to negotiate over what is an essential service, and if there is an essential service, at what level it will have to be maintained during a work stoppage. So that was already in place. So the parties had agreed there is no essential service on the rail lines, and yet the minister intervened to say, well, maybe you should take another look at it, which essentially just delayed the strike. So this was the first instance where they were clearly testing out what they could do with it. They then did something similar against the WestJet airline mechanics. And in that case, the union complied with the order in a sense, because the order didn't say end the strike. It just said enter arbitration. And so they entered arbitration, but they continued their strike anyways. And this was over a holiday weekend, and they ended up winning a pretty significant contract. And I talked to the union local president after that and wrote an article about it. And they were quite clear that that's exactly what they were doing. They were following the letter of the order, but not the intent. So they were striking anyways. And then I think the government wised up about exactly how they needed to word these things and what they needed to do. And so they then directed a further one at the Teamsters once the strike actually happened on the rail lines. And then they deployed it again against postal workers, against port workers in Vancouver and in Quebec. And in all those cases, essentially what they are doing is directing the Canada Labor Code, or the CIRB to investigate whether a settlement of a strike is likely, and if it's not, to impose a back to work order. And the board has essentially interpreted this to mean that they have no choice in it, that they're supposed to just to execute the order. And in all those cases, of course, they found that a settlement was not likely in the near term, and then ended a strike and ordered arbitration. So what's going on here is that they're creating an expectation among employers that in difficult rounds of bargaining, the government will swoop in and save them, essentially. And this is really corroding collective bargaining. It's creating this expectation where employers are not meaningfully bargaining because they don't face, or they think they don't face, the real threat of an actual strike, because government intervention will prevent that. And we saw this during this round when the Air Canada CEO was on Bloomberg News and admitted that the airline made no contingency plans to assist passengers in the event of a strike, because they thought that the government would quote unquote enforce Section 107, which is an interesting way to phrase it, because it shows clearly that he's thinking of this as already a settled part of federal labor law, when it of course isn't. It's still very much contested. Unions that it's been deployed against have challenged it in court, and it'll take some time to work those cases all the way through the courts, but it's nevertheless not. It is not it's not a settled part of federal labor law. It's very much being contested at the moment, but they're already thinking of it as something that they can depend on. And so this really shaped the negotiations. And I think it's really indicative of where we are in terms of the federal jurisdiction and negotiations. And I think maybe one last thing to say about that is that the federal jurisdiction is really a kind of unique in Canada, because this is a private sector, these are private corporations, and they're strategically important sectors. Most of them have to do with trade and transportation, and it's really unlike bargaining with public employees, which is often where we see back to work legislation and back to work orders used, because in those cases the government is right there at the table as the employer, or some arm of the state is the employer. Whereas this case, we're talking about private corporations, but where the government has a real strategic interest in intervening, because these workers are positioned so with such a large amount of strategic power in the economy. And so the government is kind of right there, not at the table, but as an interested party. And the federal jurisdiction is kind of unique in terms of how much union power there is there. Not only are these unions strategically positioned, but density is double what it is in the provinces in the private sector. So in the private sector across the country, union density is about 15%. In the federal jurisdiction, among just private sector workers, it's 30%. So there's a lot of power concentrated in these strategic transportation industries, which makes the government in some senses more likely to intervene.
I'll just mention for listeners who aren't so familiar with the Canadian system of labor relations that about 90% of workers fall under the labor legislation of their province, and about 10% of workers, I think, fall under the federal jurisdiction, right, regardless of where they are, both, as you said, federally regulated private sector companies, and then also people who work for the federal government. So just broader context for people who are not so familiar with that. Could you say something just briefly before we go on about the signal that this kind of use of Section 107 could be sending to provincial governments, and the the politics of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when the federal Liberals started using this section of the code, I think that there were a lot of right-leaning governments around the country that were looking in their own labor legislation for something comparable. And the best example of that we've seen so far is Quebec. The Minister of Labor there has tabled legislation, and it's now coming into force, Bill 89, that essentially creates their own version of a Section 107, which allows the minister to essentially extend the definition of essential services to industries where it doesn't currently apply. Quebec has essential service legislation that covers health and social services, but this would extend it to a range of other sectors of the economy, including education, which has really been a hotbed of labor unrest in Quebec over the past couple of years, and even some parts of the private sector. And this is being contested right now. The law professors union at McGill has challenged it in court. CSN is also challenging it. And as you can imagine, the Quebec labor movement is extremely angry about this legislation. And, Quebec is really the jurisdiction with the most powerful labor movement in the country. In any given year, Quebec accounts for 50 to 60% of the strikes in Canada, despite having about 20% of the labor force. So this is really, it's a powerful labor movement, and it's right now being targeted by the right-leaning government in Quebec because they are looking for something similar to Section 107 at the federal level. And so there's real risk that other governments around the country will take inspiration from what the feds are doing and look for their own ways to intervene and curtail strikes if they can.
Thanks for that. So let's move back to the strike. On the 13th of August, CUPE officials served the 72-hour notice that there would be a strike that's required by the Canada Labour Code, and the employer responded by serving a notice of a walkout, and the strike began then on August the 16th. So can you take us through the main events that happened between the 16th and when the strike ended?
Yeah, so you're right. After CUPE issued its strike notice, Air Canada responded almost simultaneously with a lockout notice, which some have speculated was an indication that they were expecting the government to intervene, or that they were putting additional pressure on the government to respond with an intervention. They clearly wanted some form of intervention and were trying to sort of guarantee it through their own lockout notice. So members hit the picket lines in the early hours of Saturday, August 16th. And then within 12 hours, the Minister of Jobs, we don't have a Minister of Labor now, the Minister of Jobs, Patty Hajdu, had issued a directive to the CIRB to determine if a resolution was possible, and if not, to direct the parties to arbitration and to end the strike. So again, it's the same procedure that we've seen over the past year and a bit, where the government directs the CIRB to say if a resolution is imminent, and if it's not, to impose arbitration and end the strike. It's a way of the government sort of deflecting responsibility. And if you look at the announcement from the minister, you can see this in the language that's used. It all sounds very procedural and technical, and that it's not really the government ending the strike. It's the CIRB doing it independently, and it's all kind of cloak and dagger a little bit. They hide behind the language that they're using and the procedure that it's done through. But in fact, it is the government ending the strike. As QB 4092 vice president put it from Pearson, snowstorms had delayed Air Canada longer than they were allowed to strike, which I thought was a nice way of putting it. Air Canada announced that they would resume flights on Sunday evening, which was just an unbelievably arrogant thing to do immediately after. I mean, they clearly thought that they had got what they wanted, they'd got government intervention, and that the union would simply comply and workers would return to the job and they could resume operations, business as usual. But QB immediately signaled that they wouldn't comply with the order and would instead remain on strike, quote unquote, illegally. So this was a huge development and completely departed from the practice of the past uses of Section 107, except for the WestJet case. In all the cases following that, unions, there seemed to be no contemplation of defying the order and staying on strike. All the unions complied, they ended their strikes, and usually filed complaints in court and started that process. But there've been no attempt so far to actually resist these through direct action and continuous strike. So pickets were erected in Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, and Vancouver, the major airports, and were joined by hundreds of supporters from across the labor movement and the general public. And then there were smaller lines in Ottawa, Winnipeg, and Edmonton. Just really inspirational, very raucous, and lines that were just really, really impressive. QB's national president, Mark Hancock, tore up the CIRB order in front of cheering flight attendants in Toronto and told reporters that he was willing to serve jail time to get a good contract for members, which was, as critical as we might be sometimes of union leadership, was actually a really powerful moment and was, was quite inspirational. So by Monday night, Air Canada was back at the bargaining table, and a tentative agreement was reached around 4:30 a.m. CUPE then announced that the strike was over and that flight attendants should return to work and that they would present the tentative agreement to members following that. So it all sort of wrapped up very quickly, and it seemed immediately like this was a sort of vindication of why striking is so important. CUPE defied the order, and within a day they had the employer back at the table and had a tentative agreement. So it seemed to suggest that the right course of action with these things is defiance and striking, quote unquote, illegally.
I'll mention that when I went to the picket line in Winnipeg, where there were only 35 flight attendants, because there's no longer a base in Winnipeg. So you have people who actually they live here, but they have to fly out in order to work based out of another place. There were more WestJet flight attendants because there's 300 WestJet flight attendants in this city. So there are lots of WestJet workers on the line, which I think is really interesting because their collective agreement's up at the end of the year. So it's very clear that what happens at Air Canada has direct consequences for what's going to happen for WestJet workers. But there was a really remarkable spirit. It was a great line to be on, and I think it's of course difficult. We shouldn't use polls uncritically, but I think the polls were pretty clear about the level of public support. As you said, the campaign around unpaid work, I think, had enormous resonance. And I think there was a lot of sympathy. And the closer people were to it, in the sense, people who were actually other airline workers, were really, really strongly in support. And even though people were, inconvenienced by having their flights canceled, there were media reports of sympathetic travelers and so on. So I think it's worth mentioning just how much support this strike actually had.
Yeah, the polling, especially around the issue of unpaid work, was upwards of 80% of the public thought flight attendants should be paid for their work, their ground work, which is, seems entirely reasonable. Unfortunately, there's no functioning airport in Kingston where I am, so I couldn't join a picket line. But I did a call-in radio show for CBC in Alberta, and those can go either way when it's an issue of labor unrest. But every call that came in was supportive of the flight attendants, which, a very small sample, but to go from, but I think was indicative of the mood overall.
So the strike ended with a tentative agreement running from 2025 retroactively till 2029. So it was signed, and workers are going to be voting on it between August the 27th and September the 6th. CUPE National put out a statement which called the gains in this tentative agreement transformational change, and it said that unpaid work is over. So what are the gains in this deal, and how do they compare with what other unionized flight attendants have and with what was on the table just before the strike?
Well, I think there's no question that there were significant gains made in this contract and that they result from the strike, that they result from, striking illegally and holding the line on that issue, and that they've moved the employer considerably from what was on the table prior to the strike. So in terms of wages for flight attendants, especially newer flight attendants, they will increase by 12% in the first year and then another 8.25% over the following 3 years of the deal, which is considerable. It doesn't make up for all of the past losses, particularly the inflationary losses during the pandemic, but it is significant. For more senior flight attendants, the wage increase is smaller. It's 8% in the first year, but nevertheless, I mean, these are pretty good wage gains, all things considered. At the same time, I think it's interesting to compare the pay package that pilots received last year when pilots at Air Canada almost struck. Those pilots, they secured an 11th hour deal. This was during an election cycle when essentially the Liberals didn't contemplate a back to work order because the Conservatives were outflanking them by saying that they wouldn't if they were in power. So there was really this electoral pressure to stay out of it. And the ALPA, the Airline Pilots Association, secured a 42% increase over 4 years in that deal, which is partly about the context of the election, but is also, I think, about the gender dynamics and the valuation of skill in this industry, that this, predominantly male bargaining unit was able to secure such a much larger pay increase. Though even in that case, there was discontent among younger pilots, especially that the pay package was weighted toward more senior pilots because of issues of retention. And even then, actually, the contract didn't was not ratified by an overwhelming majority of that bargaining unit. There was still discontent. So they managed to secure a very favorable deal. And, despite the flight attendants also doing well in this, that I think when you compare the two, you can really see the gender dynamics playing out. Other details of the package are quite technical and specific to the industry. So I think we'd have to leave it to flight attendants themselves or other experts in the airline industry to sort of work out all the details of the contract. But on the issue of pay and then on the issue of unpaid work, I think, there were there's gains to be made here and things to be built on. So in terms of unpaid work, what they ended up achieving was limited to 1 hour of groundwork that's paid and which starts at 50% of the hourly wage. So this is similar to what, as I said before, Delta is doing in the US. So it's clearly where they're starting. But the important part is that the percentage of the pay that flight attendants will receive for groundwork increases in each year of the contract and moves up to 75% by the end of it. So that is significant and does depart from what Delta gave their flight attendants previously. So there's movement on that issue. I think, it falls short of what flight attendants were pushing for during the strike and what many of them thought was, sort of the only acceptable outcome. But it does make important gains on those issues, especially around unpaid work. So, the union said unpaid work is over. I mean, that's technically true, I guess. It's just not fully compensated work, though it does increase over the life of the contract. And as you mentioned before, I think, in terms of the implications for the industry overall, it is important because it does set a precedent. Air Canada remains the sort of standard setting contract for the industry, for the sector, and it'll have an influence on the bargaining that takes place at WestJet when their flight attendants contract expires at the end of December, and also at Porter, which recently just unionized with CUPE as well. So they'll be negotiating a first contract shortly.
But there's something very unusual about this tentative agreement, because when it comes to the vote to ratify or reject it, it's not going to happen the way these things almost always happen or generally happen, because if workers vote no, what will happen is the issue of wages gets sent to arbitration, but everything else is still locked in the agreement. So what workers again are actually only voting on is whether to accept the negotiated pay raises or to have an arbitrator decide them. So it looks like the outcome was a negotiated deal, which is what CUPE leadership was insisting on, but it's not a tentative agreement like all other tentative agreements, because it's constrained, I think, within the back to work order, and workers are not actually able to reject it and push for a better deal the way that people would normally be able to in collective bargaining. The idea that occurred to me is this is an offer you can't refuse. It's a very unusual situation. So can you start off with your thoughts on what the implications are of this for flight attendants and also their relationship to the union here?
Yeah, this is a very unique situation. And in some ways, I think, CUPE secured the right of the union to bargain at the table, to bargain a contract at the table, but not the right of members to freely choose whether to accept the deal, which is an important distinction and raises all kinds of questions about union democracy. So, under normal circumstances, a bargaining team would secure a tentative agreement, bring it back to the membership for a vote, and a no vote would mean returning to the status quo. And if the status quo was a strike prior to that, it would mean returning to a strike normally. In some cases, a vote on a tentative agreement can initiate a strike, a no vote. So for example, the Manitoba Government and General Employees Union in 2023, when they went on strike at liquor stores, that was essentially what took place. The vote on the contract was a double vote. It was, if you vote no, you also vote to go on strike. So that's typically how these things go. But of course, in this case, what's going on here is that members are voting kind of with the CIRB order hanging over their heads. Because that order was not withdrawn as part of the negotiations or as an outcome of the negotiations, it means that it is effectively still there. It's still in effect. It's a threat. So to return to the picket lines would essentially be to re-engage in an illegal strike, which I don't think the union leadership is willing to entertain. So by not making the withdrawal of the CIRB order a condition of returning to negotiations or bringing a settlement to members, the union leadership in some senses secured only a partial victory. So I think it's fair to say that this has a real impact on how members can express their preferences in terms of voting on the contract. Now, it's, it is a bit challenging because you're not negotiating with government here, right? You are negotiating with Air Canada, and Air Canada technically doesn't have control over whether or not the CIRB order is enforced. So that is an additional wrinkle here. It's not the same as when a government is negotiating with public sector employees, and they're the ones also that issued the back to work order or the back to work legislation, in which case you can sort of pressure them to withdraw that. It is a bit of a different situation here, but nevertheless, because the order is, essentially still in effect, it's hanging over the negotiations, and it's kind of like a threat essentially to workers and to the union, because to return to the strike would be technically illegal under the circumstances. So I've seen many angry comments from members online about this, and that's not necessarily representative. Again, it's a huge bargaining unit, and you're likely dealing with a small sample of people, and the angriest are sometimes the loudest. But I think it does speak to this idea that there is discontent out there about the outcome of the strike, or the way that it was settled, and the conditions then that are sort of placed around members in terms of exercising their rights, their democratic right within the union to vote on this agreement. Now, it's difficult to say if the vote would go differently were the threat of arbitration not there. I don't think we're really able to say. I mean, maybe it's a case that the vote would pass either way. It would just pass by a smaller margin if there wasn't this threat of arbitration hanging over the whole thing. But I think it does create some challenges and potential risks here. I mean, there is a risk that the constraints of the vote could discourage newer and younger flight attendants from becoming more active in their union, because there is some sense of, if not betrayal, then not complete honesty here about what was actually achieved as an outcome of the strike. So I think there is a risk there, especially when you have a strike like this that was so popular and members were so mobilized around it. There's an opportunity to build on those kinds of victories, and it would be a shame to squander that because of the way that the strike was ultimately settled and the constraints that were placed on members during this vote.
I guess the thing I would just add to that is that it's important, this lack of democracy here, precisely because there are so few places where in everyday life working class people have any democratic control, right? And so unions are one of those few places where people actually can make decisions, where they're actually participating in actively meaningful ways around things that affect them. And I think we need, those are precious in an era in which, a period of history like the one we're in now, where even the very limited democratic elements of capitalist democracy are being eroded. And so I think trying to, wherever possible, maximize the amount of democracy in our unions is actually important, not just for people's relationship to unions and union power, but it's got a broader significance for the working class and for people's experience of being able to have some control over their lives. And I think that affects how people think about their place in society and politics and all sorts of other things in indirect ways. So I don't want to blow this up into more than it is, but I do think we need to think about that. I think that the costs of undemocratic union practices are only growing in the particular period of history that we're living now, with a threat from the far right and the state of working class politics as well.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of some analysis here, why do you think the top leadership of CUPE, top officials, agreed to the deal they accepted and agreed to end the strike the way that they did? Can you just focus in on that? You touched on it earlier, but I think it's worth highlighting here to think about understanding what's happened.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to be a bit speculative here, but I think, there is a question of whether CUPE thought this was the best that they could do under the circumstances, despite the overwhelming strike vote, the incredible mobilization, and all of the public support. I mean, it's not uncommon for union leadership to kind of not trust the membership in a certain sense, to be strong enough to continue a strike, or not willing to countenance the risks that are involved there. I mean, it does involve shifting a lot of those risks onto your membership. So there's that. I'm hesitant to characterize CUPE's decision to end the strike in this way as a capitulation. I think that it's more complex than that. There are a lot of things that go into a decision like this, and unless you're at the table and involved in it, probably don't have all of the information. But I think one thing to say is that it speaks to the way that being in union leadership can sometimes be conservatizing and encourage caution, maybe in moments where we'd like to see a little bit more radicalism and a little bit more trust in the membership to pursue these things farther. I do think that CUPE was quite skilled in the media game that it deployed during this strike. I mean, the buildup around the unpaid work campaign, I think, was really what was responsible in a lot of ways for the amount of public support that they were able to generate. And thinking about how this would be framed going forward, I mean, there was probably a real possibility that Air Canada would be able to frame a union refusal as turning down a groundbreaking deal. So that I think there was some sort of public relations management considerations that probably went into this, though it's hard to say. And they might genuinely believe that the example that they've set will force government to back off in the future when it comes to the use of Section 107 or other forms of state intervention. I'm a bit skeptical of this. I think the pronouncements that Section 107 is dead, that's coming from some sections of the labor leadership, I think are premature. And there's a certain sense in which, in instances like this, where a struggle becomes about beating back the repression or the state intervention, in some ways, then that becomes the primary thing that you're trying to settle here and not the actual details of the contract. And I think maybe the optics of appearing like they defied the order and were able to secure a contract was maybe enough, because the issue shifted somewhat from the details of the contract toward the outcome of actually settling something in the face of this form of government intervention. So I think that's maybe part of the explanation of what's going on here. The victory of forcing Air Canada back to the table and actually securing a tentative agreement in that way was maybe enough for CUPE's leadership.
From my perspective, I would also want to mention the way that the potential of continuing to defy the back to work order would, bring up the risk of really heavy fines, or like an order that would prevent the union from using its funds to support an illegal strike, as seen by the board. I'm reminded of how in British Columbia, back 20 years ago, the board there said that the Teachers Federation couldn't use its funds to support a strike that had been declared illegal. And I think that probably even more than the threat of jail time, those kinds of punitive measures were probably also factors in terms of the calculations that were being made. I also think that there's something about, you've sort of alluded to this, that there's something about the vantage point, the view of the world from the perspective of those officials, is not conducive to maybe recognizing unexpected opportunities and how fast things can change, how big leaps in consciousness can be, and previously unexpected possibilities that emerge when workers are in struggle.
Yeah, there's a risk aversion, I think, that comes with leadership.
And I think that if the strike had gone on longer, there's a very good chance that because flight attendants were in such a strong position that they could have won a better deal for workers. Workers would have been genuinely able to vote to accept or reject. And I think that would have been, ignoring the CRB back to work order, treating it as a dead letter. And if they'd been able to do that, it would have been a really clear political defeat for the federal government and for its use of Section 107 against strikes. Maybe workers could also have forced the government to withdraw the order, which was what the Canadian Labour Congress had demanded when the heads of unions put out the statement that they did around the strike, although I think that would have been much harder to actually win. I do think there's reason to think, based on working class history, that in moments of enormous power and kind of crisis moments like this, that things that the state has declared, in place can be ignored in the interests of, getting back to labor peace and that kind of thing. Any thoughts about that? Obviously, we're talking about something which hasn't happened, and just interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, it's difficult to say in terms of the contract gains what potential there was to push for more had the strike continued. I think with the very high level of public support and people generally really appalled over this issue of unpaid work, there were some real opportunities there, and perhaps more could have been won. But there's also a risk that public support only lasts so long, and if there was if the employer was able to frame the offer that was on the table as groundbreaking or going enough distance, essentially, it would be difficult maybe to manage that public support for a longer term strike. What I do think is interesting is that the CIRB actually didn't file their order in federal court, so it was still unenforceable in the sense that it was not an injunction yet. Until the order is filed in court, there's no option of imposing punishments. And if you read the order, you get the sense that the board was somewhat uncomfortable with, or has become uncomfortable with, its new role as the stenographer of the government, as my former colleague at the CLC put it. So I think that this is interesting in the sense that it does seem to open some cracks between the government and the supposedly neutral labor board here, that technocrats at the labor board are actually uncomfortable with the way that the government has been conducting itself on this. So there might be potential here to push back somewhat, or to begin this campaign of dealing with Section 107. I mean, the Canadian Labour Congress has said that they plan to engage in a campaign to get this part of the code removed, which I think would be a really positive thing. But I do think that that's a much longer term struggle here, and that it would be an uphill battle. But the fact that the order was not filed in federal court, I did think provided QP with some additional breathing room that they actually didn't exercise. Because this is not back to work legislation, it was actually unclear what the fines and punishments would be. Typically in back to work legislation, those are outlined in the legislation itself. And so you have some understanding of what you're actually up against. In this case, that was unclear. And with it not filed in court, we still really didn't know. I mean, there are things outlined, punishments outlined in the Canada Labour Code for illegal strikes. And so presumably that's what would have been enforced, but we were still some distance from that actually taking place. And so there was some breathing room there that actually wasn't exercised by the union. But had the strike continued, I think you're right. There were real risks about what the punishments would actually be in terms of the finances of the union. Although, of course, the unions did come together through the CLC and commit financial resources to supporting CUPE in the event that, whether or not it could use its own funds. So I do think that there was financial power there available, and the CUPE chose not to exercise that option. As I mentioned before, of course, at the same time, you're not bargaining directly with the government. So the issue of this order was kind of hanging over the whole thing and the CIRB's actions and what it potentially might do, although it indicated that it wasn't filing in court immediately because it didn't think that that was conducive to labor peace. In the event of a longer term strike, that could have changed easily, although it would have took some time to actually mobilize the resources of the court to actually begin punishing the union. But it was a real risk.
Yeah, when I said a longer strike, I wasn't thinking about a week. I think even given the amount of money that the company was losing per day, I think it's interesting to think about what more could have been achieved in even a slightly longer strike, but we'll never know. Now, a very knowledgeable QP person put it to me this way. They said, you have to hand it to National for playing their cards so well. They effectively posture as bold militants to the membership and public while effectively containing struggles within status quo parameters. They get their cake and eat it too. And when they said this to me, this was just after the strike, they were thinking about both this strike and the strike that happened in 2022 by the Ontario School Board Council of Unions, which was the subject of episode 25 of this podcast. So do you have any thoughts about that person's observation and the issues that are raised by their comments?
I think the comparison to education workers in Ontario is instructive. In that case, the union did manage to secure the withdrawal of back to work legislation as a precondition for returning to bargaining. Now, at the time, some people criticized the union because the legislation was not actually withdrawn before they went back, but they had enough. They trusted enough that it would be to return, and it ultimately was. And of course, even in that case, though, some criticized CUPE for not staying out and not pursuing the general strike, which had been threatened in order to get the government to back down and return to bargaining. But I think the crucial thing there is that the legislation was actually rescinded in that case. But again, it's because you were dealing more directly with the government in that instance, and so there's a difference there, I think. It's also different because, of course, in that case, the back to work legislation involved the use of the notwithstanding clause, which was a real threat and in some ways a graver threat. And so securing the withdrawal of that legislation was even more important. But I think there's definitely truth to this person's comment. In some ways, this is a common dynamic between the leadership and the rank and file. Leadership may want a mobilized membership to achieve things at the table, but they also have an interest in containing that militance within acceptable and manageable bounds. And so, in some senses, I think that's what's gone on here.
Any other thoughts about the strike and its implications that you haven't had a chance to bring up yet?
Well, I think, I just want to say that we owe flight attendants a real debt of gratitude. They did an unbelievably courageous thing by defying this order, and I think we shouldn't focus too heavily even on union leadership. I mean, it took a certain amount of resolve among leadership to actually pursue this and to to create the space for that defiance. But at the end of the day, it was this bargaining unit of 10,000 members that was extremely mobilized that really took the action, the decisive action. Without those members out on the line, this would not have been possible. And so I think they've really started something here that could be built on, especially in terms of beating back this wave of government intervention and repression in the federal jurisdiction, which again has implications across the country, because I think provincial governments are watching and somewhat envious of what the government's been able to do in terms of repressing strikes. It showed that these unjust back to work orders can be resisted. I mean, the typical process of, complying and contesting them in court is not the only avenue of struggle or resistance. You can defy these things. Now, not every union is strategically positioned in the same way that CUPE flight attendants were. Then, of course, this is the largest union in the country. This was an enormous bargaining unit, had all kinds of public support. So in many ways, they were in a unique position. But it does show that these things can be resisted and that direct action often does produce the results. I think also, as I mentioned before, that it does reveal that there are cracks in the edifice here in terms of the government and the labor board. The labor board does appeared uncomfortable with the way that the government handled this. And I think, it's a technocratic and maybe operates somewhat behind the scenes, but I think that there's something to build on here. I mean, people who are involved in the official labor relations community don't much like it that the government, I think, can just intervene in this way and kind of compromise their neutrality and their technical expertise. So I think there is something to that. That being said, as I mentioned before as well, I think people are prematurely announcing the death of Section 107. This episode does show, of course, that you can resist it, but it doesn't in any way, I think, make Section 107 a dead letter. Now, the CLC launching a campaign to have it removed is a positive thing, and that can be built on. But I think the government may recalibrate in terms of when it can use Section 107, but I don't think that this is enough to scare them into stop using it altogether. I think that there will be other instances where they think they have the political capital to do it, or where the strategic interests are enough, or the risks of a strike to the economy are enough that they'll invoke it again. So I think that this is a longer term struggle that we need to be, remain committed to. And I mean, I guess maybe just the last thing to say is that I think the episode overall should force us to ask some deeper questions about kind of the legacy of industrial pluralism, or the labor relations framework that we have in Canada. I mean, even though the right to strike has been constitutionalized and is now charter protected as of 2015, it seems that this really hasn't prevented governments from continually intervening in people's right to strike. And it raises questions about how well this framework is really serving working people overall if governments still continue to intervene in this way. And overall, I mean, you look at union density across the country, I mean, 15% in the private sector, just barely treading water. I mean, the system is really out of reach for most people. If you're not in a union, you don't have a right to strike at all. And so I think sometimes when the right to strike is under threat in the way that it's been over the past year in these federal labor struggles, it leads some of us to, in some ways, defend this order, of course, which is important, but in a way that I think doesn't take account of, the very important criticisms that leftists have made of industrial pluralism since we've had it, since the post-war period up to the present. In some ways, we come to the defense of the right to strike and the labor relations framework that we have when it's under threat here, but that obscures these deeper questions of whether or not this is really ultimately what we should be defending and fighting for, or whether we need something that serves working class people much better than this arrangement.
I think those are really great points, and I think I'll just add on the point that you identified around the maybe we could call like a hairline crack that exists between the CIRB and the federal government on the way that it was being used. I think the chance of maybe expanding that crack will increase to the extent that workers are more militant, right? The crack wouldn't have opened up if there hadn't been workers' militancy, and so I think that's we're thinking about. And of course, as you say, while it's necessary to defend existing rights, having a fundamentally critical understanding of labor law and the whole framework is really important, and seeing it as part of how the capitalist state administers society in the big picture I think that's important. And I think you've given us a lot to think about, because in general, I think we should be celebrating the strike that's just happened, but not celebrating it uncritically. It's a really important historical experience. And if it's going to be useful for future struggles, people have to actually learn about what happened, both the fantastic elements of it and the not so great elements of it in order for people to be able to do better in future struggles.
I agree. Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to start by asking you a question, and that is, why do strikes matter for workers?
Is it rhetorical or actual?
No, that's an actual question. I want.
Withdrawing our labor is the one real power we have.
Okay, withdrawing our labor is the one real power we have, so definitely it's very important in terms of actually stopping employer attacks and winning gains. There's also another angle that I think is important, and that's the process of going on strike. The experience of that can be really transformative for people who take part in strikes. So I think there's both the practical aspect of strikes that's so important, but also the way that it changes working class people who participate in them. And that matters if we're thinking about trying to develop the power of the working class to change society. So what I want to talk about tonight is, I want to cover 4 things. I want to explain how workers' freedom to strike in Canada today is tightly limited. So when workers can strike and for what purpose we can strike is tightly limited. I want to then look at how it came to be this way, so survey the history of that. And then I want to also ask, what have the restrictions by the state on striking done to our unions? And then, of course, as we've seen just recently, the Air Canada flight attendants have shown that it's very possible for workers to defy restrictions that are imposed by labor law. But Air Canada flight attendants are not the first group that's done this. So I want to survey some of the history of defiance, and I'm going to argue that the key ingredient that makes law-defying strikes possible is strong grassroots workplace organization among workers. So to understand where we're at today, we have to go back in time, and I want to take us back to the early 20th century and say a little bit about how unionization worked back then, because it was very different. So in the early 20th century, really before 1944, if workers wanted to negotiate with their employers, through their unions, they couldn't turn to the state for any assistance there. If they wanted the employer to recognize their union, they generally had to go on strike to win recognition against the employer, to make the employer sit down and negotiate. So there was no right to collective bargaining. It was something that had to be fought for that way. And so that meant a trial of strength. Unions by 1944, by the time you get to World War II, they were not illegal, but they also had no rights that workers could invoke against bosses in terms of going to the state to support their claims. So when issues came up in the workplace, whether it was someone was disciplined or fired or told to do something that they didn't think was right, the only thing that people could do in most cases was engage in direct action. So to slow down or go on strike to actually try to make change. It was very rare for unionized workers to have a grievance procedure, a formal bureaucratic procedure for challenging management actions. When it came to the collection of union dues, from workers, that was in almost all cases done by hand every month. Workers would have to, there'd be some people who would collect union dues from the members who were part of the union, which had both advantages and disadvantages in terms of how that worked, which we could talk about in discussion if people are interested. I'll also just mention that in this time, sympathy strikes, that is where one group of workers goes on strike to support another group, those kinds of strikes were not common, but they were not rare either, the way that they are today. In this period, employers frequently would go to courts to get injunctions against pickets to prevent workers from picketing altogether in particular places. And that kind of recourse was then backed up by the state with repression, whether it was from police or from the RCMP or militia. So if we know about the history of the Winnipeg General Strike, it was police who were used. The case of the RCMP, they were used, for example, in the Estevan strike in Saskatchewan in 1931, where three strikers were killed. The militia was called out against miners and steel workers in Cape Breton in the 1920s, for example. So that kind of repression was not uncommon. There's only one law that I'll mention that's relevant from this period, and that was a piece of federal legislation from 1907 called the Industrial Disputes Investigation Act, which only covered public utilities and industries that were deemed to be important to the whole of the economy, like the coal industry and the rail sector. And it imposed compulsory conciliation before workers could go on strike or employers could lock them out. So that meant that the state would make sure that the two sides sat down together and tried to work out their differences through a conciliation process. And there could be no strike during the conciliation period. But all this changed in the 1940s. In the 1940s, working class struggle, and in particular the mass direct action of people in the workplace, eventually forced the state to grant union rights. But these rights were linked with new restrictions on striking, which had far-reaching significance that very few people recognized at the time. So what happened during the Second World War between 1939 and 1945? This was a key turning point. So before the outbreak of World War II, we had the Great Depression. So unemployment was very high. Workers were generally really on the defensive because of that. There were important struggles and some wins, but these were very difficult years for workers and for unions. This really changed with the coming of the war because unemployment went from being really high, like up to 30% during the Great Depression, down to almost nothing, very fast. So from conditions of fear and desperation, workers began to feel much more confident, much less fear, and this had wide-ranging implications for what they wanted to do and how they would try to do it. So during the war, the federal government used its wartime powers to extend that law I mentioned, the IDIA, to cover most paid work. And they also slapped wage controls on workers to try to stop them from using the bargaining power that they had now that there was so little unemployment to push up wages significantly. But despite these state restrictions, there was a massive wave of strikes that went from 1941 to 1943. The number of strikes in 1943 was higher than any previous year in Canadian history. It was higher than the peak in 1919, the year of the Winnipeg General Strike. At that time, that year, the number of strikers in Canada was about 1 in 3 union members, like about roughly 1/3 of union members struck that year. And during the war, workers frequently defied the restrictions that the state had placed on striking, and sometimes defied their own official leaders as well. The things that were stirring workers into action were trying to get employers to actually recognize their unions and bargain with them, and also trying to increase wages, keep up with the rising cost of living, and workplace conditions of various kinds, particularly trying to limit management's power, the kind of tyrannical, despotic power that supervisors and managers would exercise over people on the job. So confident did workers become in this period that it was often a kind of strike first, unionize later approach when workers weren't already unionized. Sometimes they wouldn't even form a union. There are cases where workers just went on strike without any formal organization. So it was a very kind of DIY, do-it-yourself spirit, a lot of workers' self-activity and self-organization. So workers taking matters into their own hands, organizing themselves, rather than having the initiative come from union officials of one kind or another. And as this wave of struggle grew, it drew in workers who were distant from the white male layer of the working class that had dominated in unions. So, for example, there are cases where in Ottawa, a small number of white women who were federal government clerical workers engaged in short strikes. Japanese Canadian workers who'd been forcibly relocated into work camps protested, rioted, and struck. And First Nations gold miners in the Yukon and harbor laborers in northern Quebec also struck. These are kind of little known, but some researchers have excavated that hidden history. I should also mention that there were 2 significant political parties in the workers' movement at this time, the Communist Party of Canada and the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. The Communist Party had a lot of working class militants in its membership, but the party was utterly and uncritically loyal to the policies of the rulers of the USSR, and that meant for the first 2 years of the war, when the USSR and Nazi Germany had an alliance of sorts, the party was illegal, was banned, but it was in favor of strikes. And then in 1941, when Germany invaded the USSR, the party line changed completely, and the party was opposed to strikes for the rest of the war. They were in favor of unions adopting a no-strike pledge for the duration of the war. And in one union where they had a lot of influence, the United Electrical Workers, they actually succeeded in having it adopt that policy. Now, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, it was less organized inside of unions, but it still was a significant force. It was generally supportive of strikes, even of many illegal strikes during the war, and it benefited from politically from its support of strikes. Alongside the strike wave that was happening, you had a political radicalization, as many people felt that after all the suffering of the 1920s and the 1930s, there needed to be social change that would be beneficial for workers now and especially at the end of the war. And a lot of this radicalization was expressed in support, rising support for the CCF. Not just because it was supportive of strikes, it also was advocating a program of major social reforms, which had a lot of resonance with people. So the federal government was the Liberal Party, and it responded to this growth of workplace militancy by merely giving a kind of toothless support for the principle of collective bargaining that actually didn't mean anything in practice. And on the other hand, increasingly tightening up the restrictions against strikes, imposing stricter wage controls, trying to restrict workers changing jobs so often. And this only succeeded in generating more conflict because workers became more frustrated, so they were increasingly not just confronting their bosses, but also the state as well. By 1943, the combination of strikes and the rise of support for the CCF really was creating a crisis, political crisis for the ruling class in Canada. And when it came to strikes, they faced the question, were they going to escalate repression, or were they going to grant concessions to try to take this wind out of the sails of the movement? There was disagreement inside the federal government about what to do, and eventually the advocates of giving concessions won. And this led to a historic shift in 1944 with a wartime order called PC 1003, Privy Council Order 1003, which gave some things which would be familiar to all those of us who know anything about labor law today. So it, for the first time, created a process where workers' unions would be officially certified. So if you wanted to form a union, you would apply to a labor board, and the labor board would supervise a vote. And if you had 50% or higher support, the union would be certified, officially recognized by this state agency called the labor board. And once the union was certified, the employer had to sit down and negotiate with union representatives. They couldn't refuse to negotiate with what was now called the official bargaining agent. And once you had an official process of collective bargaining and you had a collective agreement, there would have to be in that contract a grievance and arbitration procedure. So a formal way of resolving disputes that happened during the contract, any violations of the contract that came up. And if the grievance procedure didn't result in a solution between the management and union representatives, an arbitrator, a third party, would resolve the dispute. Along with these gains, or these new rights, PC 1003 imposed tight restrictions on strikes. So the only people who were allowed to strike were members of certified bargaining units, a particular group of workers recognized by the labor board. So if you weren't unionized in an officially certified union, you had no right to strike. When you could strike was restricted, so it was not during the term of the contract. Only after your collective agreement expired could you go on strike. And then there's also the question of what you were allowed to strike for. So the only legal purpose for a strike was for collective bargaining, to advance the union's efforts to negotiate a collective agreement. So strikes for union recognition were banned. Strikes around workplace issues during the term of the contract were banned. Sympathy strikes were banned. Political strikes were banned. You had compulsory conciliation. So before you would go on strike, you'd have to go through this process, conciliation process, and there were penalties for violating any of these rules. So these things in PC 1003 then became the basis for provincial labor laws that were put in place after the end of the war, and eventually in federal labor law too. It's also important to mention something that some of you may have heard of, the RAND formula. So an issue that PC 1003 did not resolve was what was called union security, which was the issue of who was required to pay union dues and how would union dues be collected. And this was a central issue in a strike that happened in 1945, which pitted the United Auto Workers against the Ford Motor Company, which was management was very intensely anti-union. And the union was fighting for what was called a union shop agreement, which would mean that everybody who was working there would have to be in the union. And for dues checkoff, which would mean the employer would deduct union dues off workers' paychecks and remit it to the union officials. 10,000 workers at Ford were on strike in Southern Ontario, at Windsor. It went on for 99 days. At its climax, 8,500 other workers were striking in sympathy and support of the auto workers. There were mass pickets. There was a car blockade where workers drove their cars and blockaded the plant. There was support for these workers all across the region in Southern Ontario. Eventually, UAW officials agreed to have an arbitrator settle the unresolved issues. Ivan Rand, the arbitrator, the person the Rand formula is named after, came up with this solution which said there would be compulsory payment of union dues, but people would not have to join the union. So everybody who was being represented by the union, covered by its collective agreement, would have to pay dues to the union, but you wouldn't have to join the union as an organization. And that's well known. What's less well known is the other side of the coin. The union was required to disown illegal strikes and discipline participants. The union would lose dues collection if it didn't comply, and workers could be fined and lose seniority for taking part in unauthorized wildcat strikes. And this Rand formula, which started just as something that applied to these workers at Ford, spread rapidly through collective bargaining, and eventually then legislation required it to be put in place in collective agreements. The thing not to forget about all this is it took a massive wave of workers' struggles to actually force the state to grant union rights that most employers oppose. These were the rights that are, again, still the basis of labor law today. But at the same time, these new labor laws were crafted in a way to place a straitjacket on workers. They aimed to tame unions, to impose so-called labor peace in the workplace, the place where workers actually generate capital's profits. And the principle was, if there's a conflict with management, obey now and grieve later. File agreements about it later. Don't do anything that would disrupt the smooth, ongoing operation of the workplace. At the time, there were only a very few far-sighted people who recognized that PC 1003 and the Rand formula were not simply gains for workers. One of them was a Winnipegger. R.B. Russell, the person after whom the school in the North End is named. So he was a key figure in the One Big Union, which was short-lived as a large organization around the time of the Winnipeg General Strike, but the remnants of it survived into the 1950s. And in the 40s, Russell warned that PC 1003 was the servile state, and there was a dangerous state apparatus which had control of the labor organizations. A small circulation newspaper called Labor Challenge, which was published by anti-Stalinist Marxists, an anonymous writer in that paper wrote about the Rand formula. The company, holding the checkoff purse strings, hopes to convert the union into a strike-breaking agency by compelling it to declare wildcat strikes illegal and to repudiate its own picket lines. Some members of the Labour Progressive Party, which was the name that the Communist Party had adopted by this point, in Ontario, some union members who were LPP members were critical of the Rand formula, but the leadership of the party was not. Some unionists worried that the checkoff, this way of collecting dues, would create more distance between rank-and-file workers and union officials. So those were a small number of voices who did see these risks, dangers at the time. So since World War II, these legal restrictions that originally came out of those struggles in the 1940s, those things have become entrenched in labor law, and they've been generally accepted by unionized workers, which doesn't mean, of course, that they're universally obeyed, but they have deeply shaped how strikes happen and what people think strikes can happen for and when they can happen. It's hard for many people to imagine anything different than what the law says. And it's the major reason why today most union activists don't think anything other than a legal strike for collective bargaining is conceivable, is this. But just because that's the way most people think about it most of the time doesn't mean we shouldn't distinguish between, there are some workers, some people who have a reverence for the rule of law, who are really invested in respectability and just generally against law breaking. But for lots of other people, it's much more pragmatic than that. It's not that they, worship the law. It's just, they just accept that it's there, and defying it generally seems to be impossible. Or maybe it's possible, but the negative consequences of doing it are seen as being much worse than the positive gains you could get from doing it. There's the risk of being suspended or dismissed or fined or even jailed. So that's worth thinking about in terms of workers' attitudes. It's a little bit different, though, more than just a little bit different when we come to union officials, full-time union officers and staff. As a layer of people, as a group of people, you can say the union officialdom has a strong interest in respecting the law because breaking the law risks large fines and other penalties which can threaten the union institution. And they are dependent on, in order to continue to be full-time officials, on the stability of the union institution. And they also, their work can become very difficult if disruptive action really messes up the relationships they have with employers. So we need to distinguish between how the union officialdom relates to this form of labor law and the restrictions and how most working class people do most of the time. In addition to the things that got laid down in the 1940s, the state has further limited the right to strike in a bunch of ways in the decades since then. So one of these is back to work legislation. That's when Parliament passes a law that ends a strike. And the ability to do that is inherent in the provincial or federal legislative authority. It can't be removed. It's because these are supreme parliamentary bodies within their jurisdictions. And these pieces of legislation have been used many times since 1950 when it was first done to break a rail strike. A couple of examples, 2004, the Hospital Employees Union in British Columbia, which is part of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, it was subject to back to work legislation. I'll come back to what happened later in that case. 2018, it was done against the Postal Workers Union. But in 2015, there was an important Supreme Court of Canada ruling which extended limited protection from the Charter of Rights to the right to strike. So it said that the Charter of Rights protects freedom of association protects collective bargaining, and the right to strike has some protection as an extension of that. So it has imposed some kind of limited restraint on government's use of back to work legislation if they want the law to actually survive a court challenge. So it doesn't stop them from doing it, it just raises the legal bar. So that's back to work legislation. Also, more recently, we've seen the federal government using a previously obscure section of the Canada Labour Code, Section 107 of the federal labor law, the Canada Labour Code, to end strikes or impose arbitrated settlements on workers. So it did this first to WestJet mechanics, and it's been done to rail workers, port workers, and now Air Canada flight attendants. It's also been used to suspend strikes in the federal jurisdiction. So that's what happened to the postal workers last December. Their strike was suspended for a period of time. So this is not back to work legislation. It's not passing a law targeting a particular strike. It's just this previously obscure section of the federal law is being used this way. Another way that the right to strike is restricted is through essential service restrictions. So this is where the law lays down what percentage of workers or who has to continue to work in the event of a strike. Sometimes it covers a whole sector. So for example, in Ontario, all healthcare workers are deemed to be essential. There can be no strikes in healthcare. In Manitoba, teachers don't have the right to strike. It's a little bit similar to essential service. It's not technically an essential service rule, but there are some similarities. And then there's a more limited form of essential service restriction. So we have that now in Manitoba, thanks to the NDP, in this recent change that was made to the Labour Relations Act. Now the law requires that there always be an essential service agreement in place or negotiated before a strike or lockout if there is deemed to be the need to prevent a threat to health, safety, or the welfare of the residents of the province, or to prevent serious environmental damage, or to maintain the justice system. So it's a fairly high bar, but a future government could certainly appoint people to the Labour Board that would interpret the law in a more anti-strike way. Most recently, unfortunately, in Quebec, is a new piece of legislation where the Minister of Labour can direct the Labour Board to impose essential service requirements, I'm going to quote, to prevent population's social, economic, or environmental security from being disproportionately affected, or to prevent so-called serious injury to the population by a private sector strike. So it's really quite open. It's probably going to eventually be struck down in the Supreme Court of Canada, but until then, it's a new power in the hands of the Quebec provincial government. Okay, so putting all this together, what has it done to our unions? How have these legal restrictions come to really matter? What's the impact been on the workers' movement? Well, first of all, of course, only the unionized minority of the working class can legally strike. If you're not in a union, you're not covered by a collective agreement, there's no possibility of a legal strike. And in addition, it makes the most effective forms of workplace collective action illegal most of the time. So think about it. If management does something really outrageous, workers are really angry, they want to stop work or slow down to actually do something that would have an effect, they're not allowed to do that, right? So it makes the most effective forms of action illegal. And at the same time, the ban on taking direct action around workplace issues during the term of a contract creates a dependence on the only legal way of dealing with these issues, which is the grievance and arbitration procedure, right? So that's where you file a grievance, a formal allegation that the contract has been violated, and if it can't be resolved, eventually there's the option of going to arbitration. This is a really bureaucratic procedure. In other words, it's a matter of rules that workers don't have any control over, shaping what they can and can't do, and it really bureaucratizes unionism. It encourages a legalistic approach in unions. So the question becomes, can you read and interpret a collective agreement, which is often a complicated legal document, legal language? Can you argue the case that has arisen in front of an arbitrator? Those are very different questions than can you organize your coworkers to take collective action against management, right? But certain kinds of skills are fostered by this bureaucratic procedure. The ban on sympathy strikes on one group of workers supporting another group of workers in strike action is another barrier to working class solidarity. I mean, we already have a situation where unionized workers are chopped up into many different bargaining units, each with their own collective agreement. And on top of that, of course, you have the divisions between citizens, permanent residents, temporary residents, non-status people, between private and public sector workers, divisions along the lines of gender, race, and other forms of oppression. So, the ban on sympathy strikes is just another barrier among workers. And the last thing I'll mention is that the ban on political strikes, so going on strike to place demands on the government directly, this deprives workers of the most powerful way they have to oppose a government and to push for positive changes, right? Withdrawing our labor. So this reinforces people being dependent on elections as the legitimate way to try to make change in society. But ever since PC 1003, workers have at times defied the law. So this has taken different forms. One is the wildcat strike, where people just go on strike even though they have a contract in place, generally against what union officials want them to do. Back in the 1960s and 70s, wildcats were really common. In the middle of the 1960s, at their peak, more than half of all strikes in Canada were wildcats, so really common. Wildcats generally are brief, and they're generally around or focused on workplace conditions. So people are not willing to wait for a grievance to make its way through the procedure, so instead they just take direct action. What made wildcats, the common wildcats of the 60s and 70s possible was really low unemployment at that time, and the fact that it was really easy to get a similar job. You could quit a job and get an equally good or bad job in most cases without too much trouble. There were also a lot of young workers with kind of anti-authoritarian attitudes, high expectations, and a time of growing political radicalism. A more specific example of defying the law on a really large scale, which is important to know about, is what happened in Quebec in 1972 with the Common Front strikes. So this was a situation where the public sector, most of the public sector was on a legal strike for 10 days. They were then hit by back to work legislation. And the response to this was wildcats. Basically, they became political strikes because people were going on strike against the government's use of back to work legislation. 3 top union officials were jailed for this, and that led to even more wildcats as people protested the arrest. In one town, Sept-Îles, there was actually a local general strike in that town where workers took over the radio station and they took over the airport as well. And a number of other places workers took over radio stations and ran them themselves. That was very much an insurgent wave of struggle from below. Very different from that was 1976, where there was a one-day pan-Canadian day of protest, in reality a political strike, called by the Canadian Labour Congress, the federation that most unions are affiliated to, against the federal government's wage control program. So it was very large for one day, just as a protest against this wage control program. Another important historical experience, and one that I actually had the fortune to be able to participate in, was the Ontario Days of Action between 1995 and 1998. So this was a situation where the provincial government, Conservative government in Ontario, was carrying out a really aggressive series of austerity attacks on just about everybody. All sorts of different attacks were being unleashed. And in response to this, the more left-wing wing of the union officialdom initiated a fight back program which was called the Days of Action, initially in London, Ontario, and then moving from London to the city of Hamilton, then Kitchener-Waterloo, then Peterborough, then Toronto, followed by Sudbury, Thunder Bay, North Bay, Windsor, St. Catharines, and Kingston in a kind of descending side of the movement. It rose, leading up to Toronto and then declined after that. So what do these look like? So these Days of Action combined on the first day, which was a Friday, limited political strike action, and on the next day, mass protests, usually a very big march and rally. There were also marches and rallies on the Friday, but smaller on the Friday and much bigger on the Saturday. And the disruption that the political strikes caused was localized and brief, but this was certainly a break from the way that unions were normally protesting and resisting. And they rose through to Toronto, where on the Saturday there were 250,000 people or so on the streets. At that point, they really should have escalated to a province-wide day of action. And that was what officially the Ontario Federation of Labour was committed to doing. But instead, because of the split between supporters and opponents of the Days of Action inside the union officialdom, the movement de-escalated and wound down. So it just, people were often chanting at the time, city by city is much too slow, let's shut down Ontario. But instead of escalating, they de-escalated. And the pro-Day of Action wing of the union officialdom did not try to organize sympathy strikes to support some important strikes that did happen at the time. So the public sector workers, provincial public sector workers union OPSU, which is like MGU in Manitoba, it had a strike in 1996. And in 1997, there was a law-defying strike by different teachers' federations. But in neither case did the officialdom try to organize sympathy strikes. Over the years, there have been a number of public sector strikes over collective bargaining issues, which have ended up becoming law-defying strikes. So I mentioned the 2004 one by the Hospital Employees Union in BC. What happened there is the workers were hit by contracting out. They went on strike. They were then hit with legislation which ordered them to end the strike and imposed a contract on them that retroactively cut their pay, backdated the cut, and imposed other losses. In response to this, they defied the law, and remarkably, their strike then became the lightning rod for all the opposition to the neoliberal provincial government in BC. And other workers began to engage in sympathy strikes to support HEU, and it began to snowball. And then, on the Friday, it was really beginning to spread. On the weekend, a deal was cut behind closed doors that ended the strike, and HEU members were not allowed to vote on that deal. So it ended quite dramatically. The following year, in 2005, the BC Teachers Federation was up against the government. And there, a small number of left-wing activists in the union had learned from the experience of what had happened to HEU, and they passed a motion through their union which said if there was going to be a strike, it would not end, they would not go back to work without a vote. And the government responded by extending, by law, extending the length of the contract to postpone the strike. But workers voted 90% in favor of striking, knowing full well that it would be illegal, and then they went on strike. There was widespread support for the teachers among other education workers who didn't cross their picket lines. And there were several days of rotating regional sympathy strikes. So in one day, one region, the next day, another region, mostly by CUPE. The teachers ended up returning to work after ratifying a tentative agreement, which has some small gains in it, but they went back resolute and unbowed with a lot of support. More recently, in 2022, as some people may remember this, the Ontario School Board Council of Unions, which is the body for education workers in Ontario that is affiliated to CUPE, they were hit with a draconian law which prevented the legal strike that they were planning to engage in. It even invoked the notwithstanding clause of the Constitution to try to protect the law against any legal challenge. But they went ahead and struck anyway. This was only possible because of the intense organizing that had been done in workplaces over the previous year. And a smaller number of other education workers who were in OPSU and were also in collective bargaining, they joined in. There was a lot of popular support for this strike, and some top union officers began to prepare for sympathy strike action, at which point Premier Doug Ford blinked and offered to repeal the anti-strike law if the strike ended and the union went back into bargaining. Then there was a push put on the leaders of the OSBCU to accept that deal, and they ended up accepting it. So they went back to the bargaining table without a strike, supporting them and giving them power. So they ended up with a collective agreement with only limited gains. So they did, defeat the law, but what they got in terms of a contract wasn't that great. And then, of course, we've just seen what the flight attendants at Air Canada have been able to do. So hopefully people have been following this, and if we want to talk about it in discussion, certainly we can. Just really briefly, on August 16th, the strike began and was hit rapidly by an order from the Canadian Industrial Relations Board declaring that the strike had to end. And then there was a very high-profile defiance with Mark Hancock, the national president of CUPE, tearing up the order in front of a cheering crowd at Pearson Airport, seen by millions of people on the media. So it was a really important, high-visibility example of defiance. The employer then agreed to go back into bargaining with a mediator, and the strike ended early on the 19th with the workers having made a number of gains on the pay issues that were central to the strike. The main problem here is that what they ended up with is what I would call a tentative agreement you can't refuse. In other words, instead of a normal ratification process where workers get to vote yes to accept the deal or no, in which case they reject it, and they could potentially go back on strike again to try to get a better deal. In this situation, they're not actually being allowed to reject the deal if they vote no. Then the wage issue goes to arbitration, but everything else stays locked in, and there's no possibility of a legal strike. So what this means, the implications of this, we can certainly talk about, but I think this was a really important strike. The defiance was really significant. At the same time, I think they probably could have won more if the strike had gone on longer. And on the one hand, you have many other workers who are inspired by this, so there's a kind of a positive impact, particularly by workers who don't see the problems, who don't see the complications and the downside of the way the strike happened. So the further you are from the actual immediate situation, the better it probably looks. But so in terms of the example that it now sets, where other people can say, look what CUPE did with the flight attendants, we could do that too. That's important, but it's also important to recognize the undemocratic nature of the tentative agreement that workers ended up with. Why it ended this way, and all this kind of thing we can talk about in discussion. Okay, so to wrap up, I want to just offer a few lessons for people who want to fighting workers movement today. What did we learn from this history? So I think it's clearly possible that workers can go on strike in defiance of state restrictions, and they can also win. It's not just, it's not inevitable that workers do it and don't win. It's harder to win, but it's certainly possible. So the question is, what does it take then to achieve these kinds of law-defying strikes? And here I just want to quote from Noel Ignatieff. Noel Ignatieff was among other things, a steel worker. He was a part of a socialist group in the US called the Sojourner Truth Organization, and he authored a book called How the Irish Became White, about racism and Irish immigrant workers in the US. And Ignatieff at one point wrote, "Workers do not choose between various futures based solely on what is desirable. A weighty factor in their calculations is what they consider possible." So it's key question then is, what do workers actually think is possible in a situation? And we have to think about the situation we find ourselves in today, right, where unions are generally weak. Most unionized workers today are reluctant to go on a legal strike, let alone one which is defying the law. So the road to more workers being able and willing to defy the state's restrictions on striking is lots of unglamorous, patient worker-to-worker organizing around the issues that are facing workers now. So think about it in the case of the flight attendants at Air Canada, right? It was the unpaid work that flight attendants are required to do, and the low wages, particularly low wages for low seniority workers. It wasn't, the road to being able to have more strikes that defy the law is not arguing about what radicals might wish other workers were concerned about. So it's not, arguing about Gaza or the nature of capitalism or something like that. It's not talking about what we think is desirable. We may think strikes that defy the law are desirable, but the road to actually having more law-defying strikes is patient, step-by-step work around today's immediate issues. That's what can open up a road to more ambitious possibilities. So it's a question of cultivating strong bonds of workers, strong bonds among workers in their workplaces. That's the basis of real solidarity. And over time, trying to develop groups, sometimes called caucuses. For example, in the Chicago Teachers Union, a high-profile union that's called the Caucus of Rank-and-File Educators, groups of workplace organizers, people who are committed to militant, democratic, and solidaristic unionism. And when those groups are strong enough, they can run people in union elections and try to change the direction of the union. These kinds of groups or caucuses are able to pressure union officials and also act independently when necessary. Last thing, I think we should avoid ever suggesting and avoid ever implying that we need to change the law before we can do anything different, right? So a lot of people think, well, we have to change the law before we can get anything more than a standard collective bargaining strike. But I think that gets things in reverse order. We shouldn't be focusing on law reform. Instead, we should be trying to build workers' power, including the capacity to defy the law when necessary. So don't get me wrong, positive change to the law would be good, but I think state restrictions on strikes have become so important for how the ruling class rules in this country that it's extremely difficult to change the law significantly. What's more likely and more promising is strikes that overflow the channels that have been put in place since the 1940s, channels that aim to contain and divert workers' struggles. Those kinds of strikes that overflow the channels of restrictions are much more likely than any significant improvements to labor law. So I think the Air Canada flight attendants have shown what's possible. Other workers can do it again, and they can do it better. I think that's the key lesson we should take.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.